So the format of the evening is basically each of our speakers will state their position in a kind of short presentation. And following that, we'll have a conversation about kind of what this word on the screen actually means, and hopefully open it up to all of you to ask some questions as well. To briefly introduce tonight's speakers, they have much more extensive bios online, but Pier Vittorio and Maria direct the City Project PhD by Design, and they also run Diploma 14. And they really kind of question how we can break the divisions between theory and practice and reclaim architecture as a project, and how it can both change our discipline and also how we design cities. Nicholas Zimbashi graduated from the AA earlier this year in June 2018. And he currently works at Forensic Architecture, and his work sits between architecture, media, and politics. And he uses speculation and allegory to form essays in space across scales. Marie Coulon is the founder and director of Betts Project, which is a contemporary art gallery based in London. And her curatorial aim is to present architectural objects as works of art. And you'll see a selection of the architects she's exhibited to date in her presentation. Vera Van Gool graduated from the AA in 2014, and she's the associate director of the New Museum's Idea City initiative. She's organized public programs, exhibitions, and workshops for this initiative in Arles, Athens, Detroit, New York, Shanghai, and Toronto, and she focuses on how art and culture can shape cities. And Theo Spiropoulos is the director of the AA Design Research Laboratory, and he's the co-founder of experimental architecture and design practice Minimiforms. And in both his teaching and practice, he speculates on the future city and new ways to engage, occupy, and inhabit it. So that's a kind of very speedy introduction to our speakers, but please join me in welcoming them.
So thank you, Manije, actually, for the invitation and for the introduction. So as can we have the first slide, please? Yeah. Great. So we are Pier Vittorio and Maria, and as Manije said, actually, we work in the City Architecture PhD program. So we will be presenting just one position that both of us, we share. But we also share, I think, actually, with the researchers actually who work with us in the program. And of course, this word autonomous, or the word autonomy rather, has been incredibly important for us in the past few years. We are very interested in actually what it means to construct a form of autonomous practice. But we also feel that very often the discussion on this idea of autonomy becomes very vague when we don't root it in the actual conditions of our practice, and particularly the labor conditions of our practice in a specific moment and time. So what we thought to do today, before the discussion, was just to present one case, specifically the case of an artist, Albrecht Dürer, that you see now pictured in this slide, that we feel is a very interesting, actually, example of an artist who debated in his own work very clearly through visual but also text evidence his own position towards this idea of autonomy. We also think it's interesting, actually, to talk about him because he was at the very beginning, at the birth, almost we could say, of the discipline of art, in fact, as a craft, as a job, at the beginning of the modern era. And so we feel that a lot of the problems that he was facing and that he was debating in his artworks, but also in his texts, are very much actually still valid today. And in a way, to retrace actually his own position means actually to take a position ourselves actually in the on this topic. So I will let now actually Pier Vittorio take you on this very short. Sorry, can you go back just a second? On this very short, actually, 2-minute introduction why Dürer is important for us and why we feel that actually his way of discussing his autonomous or not position is still very inspirational for us today.
Yeah, actually, the reason why Maria and myself become kind of obsessed by this artist is because Dürer actually belonged to a generation of artists that realized, they were very conscious that their work was no longer based on craft, but on ideas and intellectual work. And this position was so clear to Dürer that, as you can see from this famous self-portrait, which is actually, if I'm not wrong, the very first artist self-portrait that is signed by the artist himself, with this famous actually logo that you see actually on the left. And you see that Dürer is so self-confident with his own position that he portrays himself as Christ. He almost has actually almost the blessing hand, and he really actually fashioned himself as a demiurgic creator, which is actually the idea of the artist creator that we know since then. Of course, next, Dürer actually was not only an artist, he was an entrepreneur. First of all, an entrepreneur of himself. So he wrote a lot, and he almost fashioned all his work in a very autobiographical way. But he also reflected in a rather problematic way on the status of the artist as an autonomous figure. And perhaps the most telling image of this condition is this famous picture, Melancholia, which has produced endless interpretations. And you might be familiar with the one by Erwin Panofsky. But actually, what is really interesting about this image is that it's almost a self-portrait of the artist totally lost towards actually this condition of autonomy that he or she has achieved. And melancholia is exactly this state of utter discomfort and sadness of an artist who doesn't belong to a community anymore, but is actually surrounded by this plenty of tools, but he or she doesn't know actually how to use them. Next. For us, actually, Dürer is also very important because he wrote a lot, but also he invested a lot on pedagogy. And perhaps he's the author of one of the most interesting theories of art, and to a certain extent also architecture and geometry, the Unterweisung der Messung, the instructions on measure. And what is really interesting about this book is that here Dürer, although he saw himself as an artist, he really wanted to teach artisans and craftsmen about exactly the knowledge that was making artists more important than craftsmen. The problem is that this pedagogical project failed because the book was too difficult for craftsmen, and I would say that even today it would be very difficult for PhD students to really understand the incredible wealth of precision of this book. And I think that maybe the last image, this kind of failure is very much reflected in this picture, which is one of the last illustrations of this book. And actually is called The Monument to the Vanquished Peasant. The book actually by Dürer was published in the mid-20s of the 16th century, at the time of a very famous battle that just happened before, the Battle of Frankenhauser, which is actually a battle where the lords of Thuringia have defeated the peasants who have tried to revolt against their lords. And Dürer actually celebrates, he sided somehow with the lords. He celebrates his victory. He doesn't show actually the winners. He shows actually the losers, the peasants. So it's a very ambiguous actually monument that celebrates a lost battle rather than a won battle. But he also shows actually the subject that the rise of artists like Dürer and architects as autonomous, let's say, artists actually came to the expenses of another class, the lower class, the class of peasants and workers. And for us, this is really a cautionary tale of how every, let's say, our own, sense idea of autonomy is always in conflict with class conditions that in a way, and the conditions of production that influence the work that we do. And therefore, Maria and myself believe that any discussion on autonomy should really be discussed within the conditions of production that produce our knowledge, but also our professional status. And I think this reflection at this point is very important, because if at the time of Dürer what was downgraded was manual labor, and intellectual labor was on the contrary on the rise. Today we live in an era where intellectual labor itself is being proletarized, is being actually downgraded, and I think it's interesting to reflect really on the archaeology of this process by going back to this very specific moment. Thank you.
Hi. So I'd like to talk about my position towards autonomy in relation to identity, and specifically mediated identity. But before that, I just want to briefly speak about sort of the work that interests me, because I just only recently graduated a few months ago. So predominantly what I'll be referring to is the thesis that I've been developing in my education. So I like writing essays, and architecture for me is an essay in form, similarly to how I see projects like Piranesi's Santa Maria del Priorato. In my work, I curate arguments and design allegories that are sometimes buildings and sometimes methodologies, but nonetheless aimed at questioning how we use architecture to comment, to debate, but also to reveal different ways of how we see and understand the world. And my work always tends to enjoy issues of political ontology, media, and spectacle, and how these forces inform identity and identity making. Architecture provides for me an intersection for all these issues, and a mediator in itself in studying these topics. And when it comes to autonomy, an interesting starting point, I guess, to my position would be the word nomos from autonomia in the Greek definition, that talks about, which means law, but also not law in our judicial understanding of law, or how to govern the self, αυτό. The law of a land, of a tribe, or even the laws with which we used to sort of describe objects or cities, for me extend to this idea of rules, of applied rules. Rules of a particular language, rules that define an object, rules sort of in systems of naming and indexing, of categorizing. In other words, the means by which we determine the world around us and we classify it. The way in which we define the edges of what belongs and what does not belong. So the question of where you're from refers to a place, and that place for me is media, meson, the in-between. And by media, I mean any technology, from architecture to language, that is used for communication. And the fact is, to mediate, one must always succumb to representation, whether in word or ornament. Perception is aesthetics, and Rousseau sees representation as the moment a people allows itself to be represented, it is no longer free, it no longer exists. So information is discrimination, and who curates the space of information determines the edges of identity. So I feature quite a few of my projects, but the one that you've been seeing up to now is my fifth year thesis, which is titled Terra Media, and explores precisely these notions of autonomy and identity. And this is done by treating media as a territory. And Terra Media imagines two cities, a utopia that's striving for edgelessness on your left, and a city akin to what we understand with spaces with seemingly fixed edges. And the characters in both scenarios engage in a Socratic debate across the screens. The edge versus edgeless becomes the foundational argument of communication. Since for me, without edges we cannot communicate, and without information we cannot discriminate, which is, I guess, foundational for any sort of social contract and interdependency. And in this, and then following on this, here we've got an algorithm that I've trained to read in real time the surfaces of the city. And this was a study on sovereignty, a particular term of autonomy attached to the modern sort of understanding of the state. And I guess a rather naive or maybe ambitious question was how sovereign is a building? Is sovereignty something that can be quantified? Is it something that the degrees of power essentially can form a typological spectrum? This also becomes interesting when we talk about sort of how we relinquish our own autonomy to an automaton or to other sort of media. And it opens the issue of autonomy and identity in its contemporary technological dimension. And so to conclude, so this territory of media that I enjoy investigating talks about identity as constructed from fragments that give meaning, that define edges. And all borders, the lines and symbols on a map, the fretwork of walls and the fences on the ground, and often the complex enmeshments by which we organize our lives are all explanations of identity. We construct borders literally and figuratively to fortify our sense of who we are and who we might become. And we always find ourselves living on an edge, always becoming, always in between, in media res. It is a question of who determines these edges and who and on what scale, individual, city, or state, has the power over drawing these borders that make the link between autonomy and identity something that is bound to an ever-shifting territory of media. Thank you.
Hello. So I'm not an architect. I didn't study any architecture. I've got a contemporary art background. So I've been trained as an artist. And for some reasons, I stopped being an artist and I came to London and I studied business, art business. And during one course, one teacher was speaking about what is a niche. And my English was really bad, and I'm not really good at business neither, well, at that moment. And in French, a niche is a hut for a dog. And I really liked this idea. I was, wow, I need to find my niche. And because for me it was a little, kind of a little space, a little house where you feel comfortable, where you can just be nice with yourself and do stuff. And I really liked also the idea of supporting artists, of helping them to show their work and to understand their work a bit better and to explain the work to the others. So, but I didn't want to add another art gallery to the London scene because there were too many. So I decided to do architecture. And I was coming to the AA really often because my friend Alban was studying here. And I found that architects and students were doing amazing things here, very creative. So I said, okay, let's do something. So I started to do this little gallery as a pop-up gallery. And the first exhibition I did was to go to Dubai and to exhibit Office Castengeers and David Van Severen with some photographs of Bas Prinsen. It was a really nice exhibition, but nobody came except the curator of the Pompidou Center, which was quite cool. And then I had this kind of temporary space where I've been exhibiting Pierre Vittorio and Peter Markley. And this little gallery, I was just doing exhibitions, and I found that it was really nice to do that, and I had really good replies from the public, and it was like, oh, people are starving for exhibitions like that. So it took me 2 years to find a space, and I don't know if we put the window shop, yeah, this one. So I haven't done that much. So the shelters are still really rusty. It's not automatic. And you got a space on the ground floor of 30 square meters, and there's a basement space of 30 square meters too. And then, because I'm not an architect and I didn't study architecture, the problem was where I can find architects. And I found Peter Markley online. So I went to meet him, and he said, yeah, okay. So I did the first exhibition with Peter Markley, and it was kind of a success. And then I met Pierre Vittorio, and we did kind of the same exhibition with a pink wall and a pipe in the middle of the wall. And it was really nice. And so each time I'm kind of choosing some works from architects, some works that I can relate to my art world, I think. So So for me, they are about architecture, but they are also really artworks. And that's why also, so that's Studio Mumbai, and that's, we can't see it really well, but that's kind of a little window grid that is been finding in Mumbai. And you got graphite gargoyle, which is very phallic and really heavy. And that's an imaginary city by also Studio Mumbai. So it's a panel of cow shit, with some little object which reminds him of the city. And that's Jacques Ondelatte, a French architect from Bordeaux who died in 2002. And he's never been really well known. In France, we say he's a confidential architect, which means he's really good, but a bit scandalous. So we don't really speak about him. But this project, it's one of the plans for the Jussieu program, Jussieu University project. It was a competition, but finally nothing has been done. But he's been doing beautiful plans, and yeah, just beautiful plans. I mean, I can tell about that, but it's going to take a while. But to come back to the autonomy, I really wanted to do this kind of gallery because I found that it could be the space where I could be creative in a certain way, where I could be myself, where I could show exactly what I want, because it's also a private gallery, so it's not publicly funded, and I do what I want. I've got some rules, I've got some constraints, but I'm totally autonomous, except if I don't sell the work, because I fund the gallery by selling artworks, so that's the thing. But maybe we can speak about that a bit later. Voilà. Vera?
Hi, everybody. My name is Vera Van Gool. I'm a graduate of the AA. I graduated in 2014 of Diploma 10, and then I left architecture. And that is kind of to do with the struggle that I've been having with autonomy. Go to the next slide. In a way, I don't believe in autonomy. I believe more so in Frankenstein and the kind of different autonomies that altogether shape me. Recently, I was asked to make a presentation of my work, which I thought was ridiculous. And I started off by just dragging a bunch of screenshots of basically everything that I've done, from exhibitions to writing to videos to table designs to somewhat architectural projects, and realized that none of those individual projects represented me, but the kind of blur that it led to altogether was more so an image that I could identify in. And I kind of see the city that way, as something that is inherently anything and everything but autonomous. It's a web of structures, of clubs, of power, of people, of relationships, of securities, of finance. And I guess we as citizens are somewhat the only agents of autonomy in our way to have an ideology and our ability to enter these webs, but that does not depend on who we are. It really depends on our capacity to negotiate, to break and enter, and to disrupt these different systems that are there. Could you go to the next one? So when I got invited for this talk that was basically saying to view the city as a curatorial project, I got terribly excited because it's a very problematic exercise to declare the city as a curatorial space. Cities are dark, they're unfair, they're harsh, they're stern, and like the built embodiment of policy structures, they're basically installed to serve those that are in charge and not necessarily those that are trying to make their living or make an autonomy in the city. So in one way, it is great to see the city as a curatorial project because it assigns a certain type of responsibility. To who that is, I don't know yet, but I guess a lot of my work is trying to figure that out. I work at the New Museum, where I'm the Associate Director of Idea City, which is basically a project that really is initiated to see if we could perhaps have the exercise of viewing the city as a curatorial project. We don't do kind of standard exhibitions with contemporary artists, but we like to view the city as the artwork itself, and trying to abstract what different agents, whether those are designers, architects, or community activists, make that space livable and could potentially make that space nicer or responsive to needs today. So this is the kind of snippet of the facade. It's a Sana building built in 2007, which was just before the economic crisis hit New York City, which basically made our program very responsive to everything and anything that happened in the US afterwards. You can go to the next one. What's been great about Idea City is that we run very responsive. So we've held residency programs in cities like Detroit, Athens, and Arles, which is very problematic because you as a museum come in and basically say, hey, there's some cool organizations I want to work with. You have some interesting topics like, ooh, the refugee crisis, let's make an art program out of it. But inherently, if we don't do that, who else will? That's not an argument, but it is to say that we often view the city from a perspective that is from academia, or it's from the architectural practice, but it's not necessarily from what is shaping the city: community centers, neighborhood centers, social housing, etc. And with Idea City, we've been able to build a framework that invites anybody that we feel cares about the city in, and come and present that work to an interdisciplinary group of people. What we do with Idea City often is take what we cannot do in a museum outside of its walls into public space. This is a drone shot, an illegal drone shot, because you need to file for permits to get a drone to shoot anything in New York these days, of Idea City New York, which was a big, massive public program in which Eva took part as well, when she was still helming Storefront, in which we invited over 100 speakers to respond to the question, what actions make the city to you? And those changed from whether they're design features to 3D prints to security systems to community public art installations. You can go to the next one. This is a shot of a gathering. What we try to do is play very much with the traditional form of a lecture. Is that having a mic? Is that sitting in a roundtable discussion? Or is that without a mic? And what we notice is that actually this, the setup without a mic, in which everybody could speak without hierarchy, without one assigned speaker, was the most popular and was the most interesting. One of the other elements that's crucial about Idea City is that we really try to say that the city is not made by architects. So one of my proudest, maybe not the best place here to say this, but one of my proudest achievements is that I've run many programs without architects. That's not to say that architects aren't to be valued for what they do in the city, but it's to say that the power that architects have is shared by a lot of other people. Here we are in this photo in Arles, which is an old railway station that was transformed into a cultural hub. What we do is often take buildings that aren't necessarily yet designed as art spaces and situate ourselves in there to kind of show how easy it is to transform vacant railway stations, hospitals, music schools, and transform them into spaces of gathering and thought. One of the artworks that an artist that I feel very much resonates with autonomy, with my work, with my interest, is actually not an architect. It's John Akamfra, who's a filmmaker. And this is a shot of his Hemsworth riot films, which is made in the late 80s as a response to the riots that were happening in 85. And what he did was take a medium of art, video in this particular instance, and allow that as a platform for other people and other voices that aren't necessarily empowered to reimagine and rewrite what has happened today. And I feel in that sense, if you could go to the next slide, it comes up to a lot of the work that I do. Currently, I'm working on kind of curatorial commission for an exhibition in New York that takes the same premise, art as a public space, in this case, again, video, in which we can imagine video as a site for commerce, as a site for politics, as a site for individual identity expression, etc. And if you can go to the next one. what's been terribly exciting is when I got this kind of commission, they asked me to come up with an exhibition project. And rather than me renting one commercial gallery and having 10 screens, I realized that this is more interesting if it could operate part as a kind of citywide network that activates all sites in Lower Manhattan that have helped shape video culture to what it is today. This is a still of Shigeko Kubota's Soho So rain damage film, which basically covers the damage that was done by a hurricane to her and her husband Noonjun Park's video archive in a way. And what's amazing is take my architectural interests and my interest in cities, but also allow other art mediums to kind of navigate that, and then build an exhibition that's not in one space, but it's across 5 to 10 different locations in New York. And in that way, the format of viewing the curatorial, which normally is entering a museum, is transformed into kind of a city route where you can walk into different spaces that you normally never come. You have to go up to staircases, down into basements. And in that way, the public space that you're accessible to is transformed into that of an event, into that of a situation, which brings it back to, I guess, my interest in the curatorial and the city.
Can you hear me? I'm microphone challenged a lot of times, so. For me, autonomous and autonomy is a word that somehow is symptomatic of a lot of the things that we pursue in the practice, but from a perspective of a word that I would say is more around the subject of agency. I think if you give agency to something, in a sense, you're giving a certain capacity to things themselves to actually participate in the world. So I'm going to read just a really quick statement, and then I think we'll just go through the slides. But the statement is somehow articulated by using a man named Hans Hollein's kind of provocation to architecture. So in '68, Austrian radical architect Hans Hollein proclaimed, "Alles ist Architektur," everything is architecture. Published originally as a manifesto that appeared in the journal Bau, it was a provocation that reflected a heightened awareness of the limitations of traditional definitions of architecture in favor of an understanding of design as an experimental vehicle for the construction of new forms of communication. Beyond building, Hollein stated, a true architecture of our time will have to redefine itself and expand its means. Many areas outside of the realm of architecture will enter. As architecture and architects will have to enter new fields. All are architects, everything is architecture. Architecture in an expanded field of experimentation resonates with great magnitude today. As we live in an age where science fiction has become fact, our contemporary age is as radical as ever. With change, latency, and uncertainty being the new norm, the once comfortable and understood historical models of the past have proven limited in their capacity to engage and address the complexities of what we could call the contemporary condition. As we live in ever-evolving, information-rich environments, the question is not why, but how can architecture participate? Can I have the first slide? Okay, so let's just say that that's a statement from my side, speaking from the ghost of Hollein. And at the same time, if we look at this idea of the city, if we look at the idea of agency and autonomy, the nature of what we speak about is always beyond building. It's beyond infrastructure. It's beyond representation. It's something that's shared. It's time dependent. It's a medium that actually manifests itself over time and has a process of becoming. Frank Lloyd Wright made a provocation, which was an experiment in his own right. He called it Broadacre City. But if you look at the image of Broadacre City, you'll see flying vehicles. It wasn't just a plan in terms of an idea of how a city should be organized, but all aspects fell into the scenario of actually how one would have mobility models, how an idea of this thing could happen. He provoked this idea when he published a book in 1932 called The Disappearing City. And at the same time, he used a 4 square mile kind of grid that he was sort of problematizing up until his death, until 1959. The city as a project, and I think this is something that we share, the idea of what is this new space of production was all part, I think, of trying to think about things in a much more ecological sense of how things interrelate with other things. And Frank Lloyd Wright, who, you know, one could say is a bit of a master, was actually really problematized with that kind of question itself. Can I have the next slide? I'm going to make the argument also that technology plays a very important role in that, and the idea of speculation and experimentation is absolutely fundamental to that. So I always use this slide. Anybody who's heard me before, I apologize, but it's not like I'm a Nicholas Negroponte fan with, you know, no other references, but for me, honestly, it's a very important moment in time when ideas of certain technologies were coming into the field of architecture and problematizing actually what the role of architecture was. He finished at MIT. 2 years later, he set up a lab. The lab was basically at looking at CAD systems and CAD tools. He called it the Architecture Machine Group, and then for 10 years operated within that. The world of artificial intelligence, the world of robotics, all of these things that were germinating within MIT were also part of this world. And what was the Architecture Machine Group after a 10-year period of sustained experimentation and trying to discover possibilities and potential and speculation became something called the Media Lab. Architecture set the questions that problematized a certain aspect of technology, regardless of what motivated that set up a certain kind of fundamental thesis that was shared and collective, and that was part of a communication revolution that we witnessed. And architecture, I would make that argument, played a very vital and important role because in a certain sense, our unorthodoxy approach to actually working on these problems actually was something that was very powerful. Have the next slide. If we look at today, it's a video, so if you play it, it'd be cool. We also have to think beyond ourselves. So when I speak about agency, we can speak about human-to-human interaction, we can speak about human and machine interaction, and we could speak about machines interacting with other machines. This is part of a world where everything actually has a certain agency, a certain kind of way of understanding the world. And it connects back, I think, to certain things that resonate with me, which is that we're all observers of and in the world. It's a kind of radical constructivist approach towards some of this thinking. That's neural network-y stuff. That should be a video too. I'm going to close with just a project that came to us as a speculation. So I have a small office with my brother. It's more like I wouldn't call it a business either. It's like me and my brother coming together to do stuff with some friends. We call it Minima Forms. And we were asked by Nesta, which is part of the innovation department for the UK, to speak about the future of machines. The future of machines, as far as we were concerned, was really about speculating on the idea of the city, about architecture and urbanism and mobility, and to think about how those things interrelate. The reason for that is we were part of a group of people speaking about the future of democracy, the future of money, the future of everything. Future for us is very much about the present. It's like in a McLuhan sense, if you're interested in the future, look towards today because people live in the past, or the future of the future is the present. What we were trying to look at is like, what would happen if we sort of reject the idea of planning and reject the idea of blueprints and reject the idea of a master plan and sort of speculate about what it would be like if we could create an augmenting system where that the city that we know here, like London, or a city like Detroit that's a shrinking infrastructure, had an adaptive model that could sort of participate. We just speculated on the fact that that should be mobile. We speculated on the fact that organization should be something that was real-time and that's something that had the capacity to learn and adapt and evolve with us. The idea of the house, the idea of the collective was something that would emerge through our daily interactions. This wasn't a reactive system. This was a system like a lot of the systems that are in our world that are trying to understand us, but instead of to try to understand us, to sell us different stuff from Amazon or whatever, to try to use that as a strategy of actually how we could occupy and how we could move about the city. Looking at a lot of the models that are already going to be deployed in cities like London, like autonomous vehicles and so forth, these kind of technologies, if they're not somehow problematized and if they're not explored within the space of what the city actually is, then to be honest with you, the consequences of that is that habits, just like all of the machine learning algorithms that are running today, are basically going to fossilize what we know as the model of actually learning of how we should live in the future. I'm very much interested of using architecture as a very subversive technology, partly because architecture is so slow, partly because it makes so many demands that it's shared and collective, partly because anybody who's in the business of ever trying to realize anything will understand that the social and the political are very much embodied in absolutely every step of the way, and that the cultural aspect of all of that stuff, I think, is the power of what actually unites rooms like this, regardless of whatever we want to say, whatever camp we are, if we like grids or we like blobs or we like whatever. There is a necessity, I think, for people to sort of also understand that technology is not something outside of us. It's very human. It's not something that we put back in the box. It's actually that's out there in the world, and we have to engage with that. Sometimes that means actually literally moving beyond architecture in terms of the traditional sense of building, looking at a moment in time like potentially like Negroponte, and then sort of looking at, especially for the young people in the audience, with new eyes to sort of understand actually how you can sort of contribute and participate. I'm very much interested in participatory models. I also think that agency, for me, is what gives autonomy to things. And I think the future of all of this stuff is that we're going to be living with this one way or the other. And so the challenge, I guess, from my side to people is just participate. And to do that, you actually have to really engage. And to engage, that means you actually have to try to understand before we have these kind of opinions about these subjects. The reason for that is the same people that create these subjects are also the same people that are also very fearful of it, because they somehow reinforce habit. And artificial intelligence and machine learning is not something new. This has been going on since the time of Negroponte. It's a science that died and now all of a sudden has emerged and everything is AI. And I think realistically speaking, for anybody that's invested in any of these things, I mean, my definition of architecture is that it's spatial, its practice is its medium, it's time-based, it's evolving. These things, I think, we may all share in different ways. We may have different ways of speaking about it, but I think it's something that is important to sort of talk about. So anyway, thank you.
Thank you all for a very diverse array of positions on a word that we kind of chose because it means everything and nothing. So I think it was really interesting to hear all the different positions, but I wanted to pick up on something that, Vera, you mentioned about how it's sometimes problematic to kind of jump into a situation, and I guess the brief of how we interpret autonomous is to view the city as a curatorial project, that it's sometimes hard to just dive into a situation and start to curate something as vast and complex as the city. But you also said, if we don't do it, who will? And I think that's interesting with the group of people we have around the table, that whether you see yourself as an architect, an artist, a curator, what's your role in kind of bringing together these different forces or providing platforms? And I think this applies to everyone. Providing platforms to change the city, to actually fight against these conditions of class and production that are limiting maybe how certain people have access to shaping the city, or how do we control like the media and identity of the city. I think each of you have a different position on that, but I guess there's a way to bring all of you in conversation with each other to speak about where you see your role in the curatorial project of the city.
Do you want me to?
Others will follow.
So I think what has been exciting about the role that I have, which is not to have the responsibility of an architect, but being able to shape the responsibility at large for architects, for designers, for artists, for policymakers, strategists, etc. one of the key things that I think is crucial to understanding the city is to not sit in a room just with architects. And it's really not because I don't like architects. I love architects. My brain is an architect. But it's because I think we have a tendency to select things as if they're bricks, as if they're tiles, as if they're something that we could erase or delete in a model, or we can backspace in a document. And that's not the city. The city is everything else. So when I say that it's problematic to come in as a museum, and as you said, we've done programs all over the world, literally in every part except pretty much, quite ironically, Africa, because we can't get funding for it. Strange thing, where like we would love to go anywhere, but it's very hard to get there, right? It inherently carries the problem of what the museum as an agency is. It brings forward this conversation about authenticity and players. So what we try to do is shift the conversation from the city as a designed project or something that somebody can actually even be an architect on, but take it as a condition that is now. And then we as a museum have our own building that is static, but everything else we can change. We can change our exhibitions, we can change our staff, we can change our wallpapers, and we can change who we're working with. So when we go into these cities, one of the key things that we actually identify, it's part of a kind of learning curve that I've been undergoing, is everybody that disagrees or doesn't want to work with us is quite likely the person that we want to work with. So this ability to choose a line or a color or a wall or a reference is completely out of your own, is taken away. And that is a very unique experience that is very different in architecture school, but it comes back to the purpose of selecting, and it comes back to a conversation about, obviously, intellect and intelligence, but also about morality. And I think that is a lot what is missing. Autonomy without morality is very little, in my opinion. And I think that is the same for us as a museum. We understand that we're not the building sector. We're not completely dependent on public funding. We have a lot of philanthropy that supports our projects. We're not architects, we're not designers. We're basically nobody except the ability to create situations and experiences. And that is to say that we are also in such a privileged position to do so in New York that some of that privilege of being a cultural icon in one way can bring people to the table that normally would not sit in the table. One of the key things, and one of the projects is actually most architectural, and what I'm proud of is a project we did in Detroit, which was my first residency program, a very complicated city. And what you had there is quite simply put, policy people speaking to policy people, architects speaking to architects, and activists speaking to activists. Nobody was willing to sit around the same table. But all of a sudden, when you as a museum come in as a neutral agent, you have the ability to build those bridges that aren't necessarily in place. And this is not an academic exercise, this is not the most interesting essay, but it is a really great project about collaborations that just don't happen after school, that don't happen when you're stuck in your own discipline. And in that way, to use the curatorial gaze to look at the city is, I think, a very interesting exercise. But the word curatorial on its own, I think, should be the word that's been under investigation today, because I think that is a very complex word, because it inherently describes a certain type of choice, but I don't think everything is a choice. You used it just now to say that you curate text or you curate sentences or something. And that is the way that we're describing this word. It's choosing, is it designing, is it what is curating, actually? And I think because we are an established museum, we have the ability to ask ourselves that question. I, on my own, have much limited autonomy to ask that question. And I think that is why it's also an exercise of skill. I think it's interesting that we are all talking about that from a different perspective. And UFCISA does very well looping back in.
Does anyone else want to respond to that? Maybe Pivota and Maria, because you started to talk about, I guess, the point that you made about autonomy without morality, because I think that was something that...
I think that there is something we probably both share, having worked also sometimes together on projects that have to do with city administrations and so on and so forth. And it is, I guess it is pretty obvious to all of us that architecture is just about the least autonomous form of practice actually today. It's maybe the form of practice that has the least or the least recognizable value, and that 99% of what we do is really about compromising, is about actually negotiating and is about actually taking in much more than in fact designing or imposing order. And I think that all of that is something that we have to accept, because that's the reality. But what I really liked actually in Theo's position is the fact that actually you still have faith that architectural knowledge has something to contribute to all of this, no? That there is a form of agency that we can still, you know, recuperate. And that's something that I think we very much share. We share this kind of hope out of almost despair of our experience. In fact, actually with clients, and particularly when these clients are institutional clients, is almost worse than when they are in fact actually private clients. Actually, I would say that it is worse in many cases. So the question is that probably for us, this word autonomous is always like this kind of quest for a form of hope that we can really recuperate this agency. And another thing that actually I think you said is absolutely spot on is this question of understanding the ecology in which we operate. And I think it's fantastic the work that you guys do actually with technology. We don't quite have the skills to do that. What we try to do is to look at the economic side of things, but I think that two things kind of meet in, you know, trying to understand what are these conditions that make us, in fact, actually so not autonomous. And I just want to say one other thing. I found really incredibly meaningful and somehow both heartbreaking but also interesting when Marie explained actually how she was looking for her niche, and she said, my niche is going to actually make me autonomous as much as I can make it work within market conditions. And I think that is exactly, I think it's a very good observation, because that's what we are all looking for, no? How can we create this niche within market conditions that are not always in our favor? So, so yeah, I would say that, yeah, we really, I would agree, we don't really believe that autonomy as it is exists, but it's definitely a horizon towards which we try to row in that direction, let's say.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that although I have a lot of respect for curators because they are workers like anyone else, I'm a little bit suspicious about the whole idea of curatorial as a kind of ubiquitous now, not even practice, because I think as a practice has a value, but really as a kind of condition a lot of people now use to describe how our world works. And the reason for that is because it is exactly this kind of ubiquity of artistic practice, and to a certain extent also architectural practice, that is also often used by institutions to, I would say, economically downgrade the work of artists and architects, because the more actually anything can be architecture and anyone can be an artist, which is great, of course. And of course, it has a lot to do with also democratization of something that until recently was very elitist. The flip side of that is that artistic work and architectural work doesn't have value. And the skyrocketing precarity that is a reality of our profession is also the result of this kind of 1960s ideas that, you know, anything could be art and architecture. And I think now this is a very institutionalized statement and position. Very powerful institutions are really using this ethos as a way to increase actually precarity, but also to increase the valorization of those institutions. And so for me, the question of autonomy is also a question of self-valorization. I mean, how we can find strategies even within those institutions that somehow are not just in a kind of blind way creating value for the system, but create value that can also be taken back. And I think this is actually why the curatorial, it's a very interesting battlefield. I mean, I'm not saying that it's something we should reject, but we should question this kind of paradigm. Because for me, the curatorial today in our own profession is the real social factory, is the factory in which, in fact, exploitation is often being advanced.
It's funny because I always had to refuse to have the word curator, but no one could call me anything else because they could not say, those are not buildings, therefore what are you doing? But it's interesting that we are talking about curatorial with the word autonomous in the wall. When the word autonomy somehow crashed the art world or the architecture world, was in the search of something that stood in front or in relationship to other disciplines that actually could be identified as such and could actually stand in moments of somehow inability to articulate the value or to articulate the power of something and to say, you know, there is a particular idea that actually needs to be respected, that needs to be understood, and that needs to be valued. And so the problem within that root of autonomy as a kind of a singular argument that no one else could understand, that was actually taken for a ride within architecture, left us in this place where we are right now, that is on the side of the road, in which no one understands, in which that space of autonomy, what actually is that what we do, what is the value that we bring. And that actually did not only happen in architecture, I think it happened in many other fields, and that's why the figure of the curator, that one who actually articulates, that tries to make sense, that tries to actually bring people together from different disciplines, from different areas, who actually ultimately brings visibility to the labor structures as a way to really bring that artwork into another space, is something that I find it paradoxical. The worst moment of my curatorial career was when actually I was invited to a conference that was called Curating the Curatorial. And I wanted to really get out of the room, right? I was like it's totally unacceptable. But so the question here is to understand the symptom of the usage of that word, of like, we are creating a cheese, we are creating a text, we are creating a word. So because we do need to understand the agency ultimately, and that I think is what was brought. Like, what is that? What are the questions that we are asking? What is that we are trying to address, regardless of that disciplinary label that we carry? And so for me then the question comes into ultimately, what is that we want to use that autonomy for? And in this case, you clear it very clearly. Let's look specifically into questions of labor, right? Talk about agency, but then the question is, of course, trying to understand how that entire new universe that is emerging in front of us with algorithms and AI is actually making us either a product of capital or actually can make a product of life or a product of engagement of some of the values that we carry. So the question here to me is that how do we abandon that idea of autonomy and how to actually raise the new questions? Because I think autonomy in and of itself is ultimately a space of strength and a space of power, if you want. And I think Idea City, in a certain way, a project that I do know obviously very well, was always about what are the ideas, right? What are the ideas that each one of those cities wants to put forward? And how does a school of architecture like the AA tries to not be an autonomous institution in itself, but actually tries to understand itself outside of its boundaries and tries to start asking the right questions. So maybe as a way of shifting the conversation to the audience, I think it's time for you to ask the questions and maybe to even make your own little 2-minute articulations of autonomy. So
I would just, if I may add a question, thanks to all your presentations. I mean, I would like to link the notion of authorship to the question of autonomy. And authorship, not necessarily a singular act of isolated imposing my ideas, not at all. There is collective authorship, there is critical, there is doubtful authorship, but authorship as a sort of taking responsibility for having ideas. So, Idea City, ultimately, I think the idea is related to the brain of individuals, and the individual, as you are all individuals, are sort of related to the power of your brain, whether this relates then to mechanisms and autonomous mechanisms of machinery like artificial intelligence and so on. But ultimately, I'm questioning my role, your role as authors. Is authorship still a concept? Or are we giving up authorship? And Pierre Vittoria was speaking about the, let's say, institutionalized crisis of the profession, perhaps, delegating to the curator, but that doesn't matter. Curator is maybe a different form of authorship. But I'm questioning the idea of authorship. Do we still believe in that? Not as a heroic role, can be a very modest, a very humble way of making a contribution. But do we believe in authorship in relation to autonomy or not?
Well, as much I enjoy, of course, like anyone else, to be the author of my own work, I also have to say that if you really study the history of architecture, there is nothing more damaging than the whole idea of authorship. I think that for me, architecture really started to go downhill when this obsession with authorship, which actually was clearly stated by Leon Battista Alberti, became actually the main tool through which, in fact, intellectual labor was elevated at the expenses of craft, of manual labor. So, of course, we all enjoy to be the author and, as you said, to take responsibility for what we put forward. So there is absolutely something rewarding in being acknowledged as an author of something. But we know that in our profession, authorship in architecture is pure hypocrisy. Because we know that behind the face of the architect and the name of the architect through which a building or a project is identified, there is an army of people who often actually are really producing, in fact, the architecture. And precisely because their authorship is not acknowledged, we have the labor consequences that we all know are very problematic in our profession. So I think we have to be very careful about authorship, because it's something that definitely satisfies our ego, and all of us have an ego, of course, but historically speaking, it has been a tool to really downgrade the agency that actually produce architecture.
And not just architecture, if I may add. And I agree with you that the curatorial is problematic in terms of institutions, 100%. And I believe that authorship is very complicated to assign to a curator, the same in a way as it's assigned to an architect. It's a branding exercise for inherently a fancy term of a decorator. But we do live in the reality that is today, where authorship is, like you said, it is kind of very much important to have yourself in order to make a living, right? So I think the curator role and the curator as a word has basically become part of a branding exercise to help people show that they have an individual take on it. Look, if I work for an institution, I have no need to put my name on anything. It's a new Museum Ideas City program, and the way that I work, I really have no interest in who puts the best ideas forward, as long as the program is great. But when it comes to something on myself, I need to think about what my own feasibility is and how I fit into the structures and the economic systems, etc. And all of a sudden I have to be like, oh my God, I do have authorship, because that is the system in which we work. So it's authorship, like how you said, is linked to individuality, and that is one of the key issues that we are facing today, I believe, how we deal with individuality in terms of much larger processes. I'm very happy for the entire discipline of curator to be reduced, thrown off, the entire world, as long as I do still keep my job, in a way, right? So that is the complicated system, sorry.
Oh, no, it's totally cool. Yeah, I think sometimes these conversations, they become amazingly cyclical. Like, and to take Eva's point about asking questions, I think somehow we need to find mechanisms to ask more appropriate questions. Now, that's not, it's not me being a bad boy. It's me just sort of asking, if authorship, like was just mentioned, was something about individuality, could we construct frameworks that allow for co-authorship? Can we say that things could be collectively written instead of curatorially authored? I mean, I think I don't know, the more and more I get into this world, the less and less I really believe in language. I feel like language has become a kind of crux in which we feel like we understand each other. And actually, when you see work, and I think that that's what's amazingly powerful in any form of creative practice, is that somehow the narrative that's attached to it is separated. It's useful sometimes to have that filter, but realistically it's autonomous on its own. It's in the world of its own, and it has possibilities because of that. And the only reason I'm stating that is because I think that everything that we speak about is a paradox. We want to have individuality, we want to be able to participate, and to go back to Maria's point, I mean, I use technology, but I don't foreground it. You may think that, not from my presentation, but realistically speaking, that's the only field, that's the only thing that I can speak of that is a framework that has a possibility to be inclusive, if we create frameworks to be inclusive. And I think those are the ways that you can resist things and you can deal with accelerated ideas. And I mean, ideas by themselves are, you know, I used to work with a guy who said everybody has ideas, who gives a shit about ideas. Not all of them are good. And to be honest with you, not everybody is committed to them. And I think like the things that we can benefit, and I obviously have a deep love affair with history as well, but for very different things, because I'm not looking to see if I'm original, I'm looking for friends that can help me sort of think about this kind of continuous experimentation. And for some of us, because in a strange way, like, I don't know, maybe the students see PV and Marie and myself as people that are not practitioners in a sense, or we're very academic, but actually we all have worked with planning commissions, and I'm still waiting for some day that this national park in Greece will maybe sometime happen before I'm 80 years old. And that's if I get there. But these things are just so much part of the practice. I just mean like language about what a curator's role is today is maybe not the same. In the 70s, maybe it had a very different kind of agenda to sort of break certain orthodoxies. The curator today may have a different value. What we mean about curation at the scale of the city is much more about maintaining certain forms of diversity, which are actually being problematized by a lot of things. Partly technology, for sure capital, we all want to have a job, but realistically it's not about us. The project of the city is not about us individually, our moment in time. It's about actually how we develop a framework, and that's why cities are beautiful projects. They resist anybody's individual idea. Time somehow is a medium that actually is probably the most beneficial thing for us to discover. And I just think like, I only mention that because I think like everybody here in the audience as well has to also feel a certain responsibility to do that. Because otherwise, then we have committees, and committees take decisions and not people. It's this, it's that. We somehow move away from actually taking responsibility. But I think any of us would probably say that we feel burdened with responsibility for every action that we do, for every interaction with students. We're trying to nurture something, and that's why I think, I don't know, I have to be blindly optimistic, because to be honest with you, everything says other. And if that's the case, then I should retire in Greece and grow tomato plants and some watermelon and call it a day. And I say that with like a sense of urgency, right? We're in a place like the Architectural Association where any idea is open. We were just talking about going to schools prior to this in the States, where amazing infrastructures of institutions, brilliant people, but the level of conversation right now is not a conversation. It's kind of just, you know,
it's terrible.
shop talk. It's terrible. And so that's...
we have to address the elephant in the room, no? Sorry.
We have to address what?
The elephant in the room, maybe.
Which elephant?
Because I mean, there's this word autonomous.
Yes.
And we have an author who has written extensively about autonomy.
Yes.
It's about who possesses the means of production, no? And
yes.
In their presentation, they show, I mean, I think it's a trick, and that's why I want to ask a question. There's something of sadness, of desperation, that architecture is not capable of doing this, no? If you show the melancholia.
I mean, not at all. Actually, as Maria said, and I completely subscribe, for me, real hope comes only when you really try to be very aware about the conditions in which we produce architecture. I think for me it's more desperate to be simply to live of illusions, of autonomy that are grounded into nothing. But when you actually realize the extent in which our profession has been historically produced, then I think there is real hope that a counter strategy or something that can be discussed and can be also achieved as a group, not as a single author, can be advanced. So we really feel that on the contrary, we were hoping, or we thought that our presentation was full of optimism.
Also, let me make one footnote. If it wasn't, crystal clear, I think what Vittorio was trying to do by showing our delightful Albrecht Dürer is that essentially this is a word, and together with the word authorship, because the two kind of go hand in hand indeed, that has been put to the foreground of the discussion by a bunch of bourgeois white male in a specific moment, in a specific place. And we are anything but that. So maybe the time has come to do the same thing that those guys actually did back then and try to find a new framework, maybe new words, maybe there are no words, as Theo said before. I don't know what, but I think that kind of realizing the place in which we are and how we got there, and how a specific class got there, and how specific guys in a specific moment in time and in a specific culture actually got us there, is quite crucial. Because from the point of view of a woman, for instance, for me this word makes no sense. I mean, I'm sorry, from the moment that we are born, it's like, I mean, there's no way we can be autonomous in so many different ways. So what is the word then that defines this, if there is a word, or what is the practice that defines it? I think that this is the question. That's why actually when we discussed actually bringing in this case study, we both agreed, because we were like, okay, it's just so interesting to see how historically situated actually this word is, and how maybe it doesn't really describe what we're looking for anymore.
Yeah, also, it's interesting, Dürer actually was a very successful artist, one of the most successful, not only in terms of his work, which is incredibly amazing, but he made a lot of money. He was very rich, and he had a beautiful life. He traveled a lot. And still, actually, he was unsure that basically the success he achieved, and which was not only his success, but the success of a class, an emerging class of bourgeois artists, was really grounded into something he was confident with. And I think that really shows that from the very beginning, you know, our own profession is grounded on very unstable and fragile structures. And I think that to remind ourselves that doesn't mean that we just fall in despair, but that we become much more aware and find actually this room for autonomy.
But to pick up on what Maria said and what Thea said about language in general, I think we do tend to become quite obsessed with words. And sometimes, yes, they're very context specific, they're very historically specific, but also they also subscribe to certain systems of understanding, like our understanding of what is an individual, of what constitutes an autonomous individual, is a very sort of, one could say, Western sort of understanding of the importance of the author or the individual in art, where in a lot of other cultures it could be interpreted differently. Or if we take even sort of that level further to sort of a political understanding of not only autonomy, but let's say sovereignty, like some in our understanding of like what constitutes an autonomous individual in many sort of systems, the idea of agency only depends on whether or not you're able to have that agency, whether, like Arendt would say about citizenship, whether you have the right to have rights. And if there's no, so I guess maybe the question is an issue of control, and it becomes then a paradox of like, do we want control as authors over work? Do we want control over ideas, or are we within systems themselves that like distort the way that we understand control? Like I was speaking about this topic with a friend from New Zealand the other day, and we were saying like his idea of like him as an autonomous, or more specifically, let's say a sovereign individual as a New Zealander, is very different to an American's idea of individuality and sovereignty, based on sort of the systems, the political systems in which constitute what defines autonomy, whether property is important to even have a starting point when it comes to having agency, or and I guess what's interesting with that I find interesting with where we're at now technologically is that digitally everyone seems to feel like they have a level of agency, because everyone is able to see each other in a certain sense, but then this issue of curation as well. Everyone keeps talking about how you self-curate on Instagram, you self-curate on various platforms, but does that really mean autonomy, and is that something we want, or is that yet another construct that at the end of the day we're all sort of participating in a totally like collective system that just values the individual as a social construct rather than a reality?
Well, who scripts the algorithm is the real curator.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, on that point as well, like for me, this paradox of authorship comes into this issue of bias. And when we talk about like these autonomy as well in tandem with objectivity, like this, like the fact that these technologies or even the autonomous person, the author, exists in a bubble outside of either a discipline or other people is, in my understanding, pretty ridiculous, because everything is interdependent. And yes, you work within an economy. Yes, you need to. You rely on the fact that you need to make money to set up a business, etc., etc. But to some extent, those things could be debated, like whether they're negative, whether they're positive. But I don't think it. Like I think sometimes we obsess on this dream of like self-determined individuals when we've always been sort of very collective, and it's more like this framework that maybe we started talking about is just rethinking the way we act in systems and the way that we implement agency that could change our understanding and maybe change these words and stop obsessing about them.
Thank you. Richard Wolf. Could I just thank Marie Coulon for your generosity of letting us into your gallery a few nights ago to look at the work of Denise Scott Brown and those beautiful drawings. And my question to you, Marie, is do you feel it is only when an architect draws that they are autonomous?
I don't know.
Why are you obsessed by drawings?
I mean, I love sculptures, but drawings are easy to ship. They're easy to transport. They're easy to display on a wall. And they're more easy to sell than a video, actually. So, especially if they are about architecture. But I found also that, and also the gallery is small, so drawings, I mean, it's more easy to deal with. When I did the exhibition with Jan de Wilder, I mean, I still have these wooden elements in the basement, and I don't know what to do with them. So I'm not using the basement anymore. But what I like with drawings, well, with the drawings that I showed, so the one from by Pier Vittorio or the ones by Philippe and Florian, for example, it's like they are showing what they think about architecture, or they are showing their reflections through this medium of drawing without drawing architecture, actually, something like that. And I really like this kind of where we are out of the frame, and we are between art and architecture, and I like to be in this kind of gap with those artworks. And also I like that people are a bit lost, because sometimes they think it's too artistic, so they don't understand, and sometimes it's too architectural, so they don't understand neither. Depends where they are. So well, I really like this kind of gap or accident where I'm working. And I don't feel that I'm a curator. I'm making exhibition. I mean, if you go in the art world, you never hear that much this word like that. It's like architects are using this word at the end of each sentence. Like I will say shit, you know, at the end of each sentence. It's really strange. In the art, you got curators, they are doing exhibitions, and they are thinking about how to do exhibitions and how to show the work of an artist or a group of an artist or a reflection or a movement, but that's it. So.
But it is a protected title.
Yeah.
It's not anybody that gets that title. Like when you work at a museum, when you work at a museum, you start as assistant curator, then 3 years in, you become associate curator, etc. So it is. I mean, there is so much colloquialism within that term, and I think that is kind of funny because I don't believe in the hierarchy of the curatorial, but it is in the art world, like, people salute you when you have the title curator versus project managers. But in all fairness, project managers are often more doing the curatorial work than the curator.
Yeah, but maybe that's why I deal more with independent curators.
Yeah, but also you are raising, I think, a really interesting point for me that somehow brings together Marie's experience and mine, in that actually I have a small publishing business, and I think both in our cases we really tried to be, in a way, autonomous from institutions. When I started, and it's actually a project that I discussed actually also with Marie from the very beginning, the big question was like, should you find funding from institutions? And everybody told me, you're never going to be able to make books if you don't have grants and, you know, big institutions actually behind you. And then my answer was exactly Marie's, no? I mean, as long as actually we have a product that somehow encounters a niche, you can find a way to do it yourself. But then, of course, all the famous, you know, conundrums start, no? I mean, you are only as autonomous as the market allows you to be autonomous, and so on and so forth. So I don't have an answer for that, but I have to say that this, in a way, this attempt to try to be independent, if not autonomous, let's say independent from institutions, is really difficult in some cases, because of course you have to find other ways to make things work. But at least for me until now has been very, very important. I always refuse people who came even already with grants that told me, you know, I have this X amount of money, make me a book. That's not what I want to do. I want to have a much more, in a way, simple and direct relationship with the people who buy books. I mean, if they don't buy them, that maybe they are, you know, maybe they shouldn't happen. You know what I mean? Because they don't encounter a need somewhere. So that's why I have huge respect actually for what Marie does in terms of actually really on purpose being a commercial gallery.
Can I ask one question? If we start with your new definition of architecture from Hans Hollein, when he was just referring that everything could be architecture, everything is just regarded as architecture. And the same time of the same period, more or less, a little bit later, Manfredo Tafuri, he was just referring to architecture is dead, referring to architecture that is not relevant anymore to the capitalist mode of production and etc. So my question and observation, more or less, is what architecture brings to the table, especially to the people who design all these kind of machines and algorithms, meaning that in the end, why do we need architects to deal with this? If not, because so far we are not talking so much about the architecture as containing corporeal space anymore. So I'm inverting, I'm just doing what you are doing, the negative, and I'm asking you, why do we need architects in your own kind of discourse? Why the discipline is still relevant and not just a stratagem of evasion, let's say, of talking about architecture?
I got it. That's cool. Can I ask a question? Could you just tell me where you're from?
No.
You're not an author and you have agency, so I will respect that. And I'll answer anyway. Realistically speaking, I think architecture is very important because I see architecture as something that is fundamentally spatial. And I think my definition of architecture is not one that is somehow privileged because I'm a registered architect, because I'm not. It's not because I'm a resident artist in Somerset House, because it doesn't really matter. But it is because fundamentally I think we've collapsed everything into this world where we speak about things as everything. One of the things about Hollein is that the provocation was a provocation. A provocation was in a moment in time when it was set up as a way to have a very social and cultural critique about the status of what constituted architecture. And I think as a conceptual project, I think that can manifest in many different mediums. And one of the things that I bring that back is not because I'm like a hippie lover of the 60s and 70s, is because I feel like those same provocations today are actually very meaningful. When he says, in some sense, architecture will have to go beyond its own discipline and that discipline will have to absorb other things. I think it's fundamentally about acknowledging what makes this moment in time ours, so that we can participate in that. Because realistically speaking, even in terms of practice, maybe because I'm older than you, I think, at least more gray hair, when I was studying art, or my brother was studying art and architecture and all of this kind of stuff, everybody wanted to get beyond the screen. Everybody wanted to move away from these things. We were beyond the image. But everything has now been collapsed. We don't speak about space. We don't speak about actually the idea of bringing things together. And I think architecture as an environment, or as a definition of thinking of it as an environment, enables this. And through that, I think we speak about time, and we think about agency, and we think about that stuff beyond the kind of humanistic approach. I don't really believe that algorithms are dictating our world. I think we are not really sort of responding to the idea that these things are obviously ever evolving. It's not about robots. It's not about these things. Actually, I wanted to talk about paradox because there was a guy who, his name is Warren Chalk. He's another one of those characters. And he wrote an article in '75 here, and it was titled Robots and Trees. And if you don't mind me reading this, it's literally like less than 2 sentences. We must construct a living paradox. The experience of what it is without naming it brings about the freedom of what it is. And I think that that kind of plurality of thinking about things in a much more diverse and speculative way, I think space kind of enables that as a medium. And beyond that, to be honest with you, if you're reading Sphere and Labyrinth, or if you're reading an issue of Bao, I could care less. What I think is really important is this kind of ecology of ideas, I think, have a place. And then I think technology allows us to make that place meaningful and bring that back into the world of architecture. If Negroponte's world was leaving architecture, like a lot of those guys were, like a lot of the radical architects, the utopia guys, they left the practice of architecture to be more ephemeral, to be this, or to be super corporate and leave their radical ideas on the table. I think we've witnessed that world, and I think actually architecture, the space of the city, urbanism, mobility, infrastructure, these are all part of our practice. And I think with the densification of cities, and what's going on, and the amount of stuff that's been built probably in the last 30 years probably eclipses everything that's been built before. So how do we sort of cope with that? And how do we do that in a meaningful way? I think architecture is fundamental in everything that we do. And it's...
How do we communicate with one another? Because if you go towards this kind of...
Wait for the microphone, please.
It's just building on his question. Because if you just go towards this extreme plurality, where the second root of the word autonomous is law, which is a collective contract. And if everyone in this room right now declares autonomy, there is no law. So how do we even communicate with this kind of plurality? How does one architect talk to another?
Are we playing like total extremes? Like we're going to move into the jungle of complete animalistic survival? Because that also had laws too. The reason I'm saying that is like, if we really believe that with all of the things that we have, we are actually constructing better ways of understanding. If what we're talking about is knowledge, not just about going to school and getting degrees and specializations, then we should be able to kind of conceptualize frameworks that allows for diversity without normalizing everything. It's not about optimizing the world so that it can be faster, cheaper, blah, blah, blah. We have to sort of invent, I think, new terms of reference. And I think that's motivated by actually having a shared kind of understanding of a world that you're operating in, because fundamentally you have to respond to that. But I also think with a certain degree of optimism and a certain degree of responsibility. I mean, you shape a bit of the world that you influence on a daily basis. Now, it's not about you do whatever you want, and I'm not sure that the legal world is the world that I would always look to, because it seems to me, especially with institutions and everything else, you know, we're in a world of liability, and it's about like not taking any risk. Why don't we shift the conversation and say that actually if we continue this way, we have the most to risk? You want to talk about environmental issues and ecology, you want to talk about social responsibility, you want to talk about the nature of public space, any conversation I think is more than appropriate. I just basically think, like, unless you accept the world as something that's so positive and great as the way it is, you should actually try to give yourself some responsibility to actively engage that. And I think, why not architecture? Participate, not dictate, but be an active participant in this world.
No, I think that, I mean, it's an interesting discussion. Perhaps something that we don't acknowledge is that there is a profound antithesis between the concept of autonomy and the concept of architecture. I mean, the word arche, from which actually architecture comes from, means actually command, means actually something that rule. And actually, you know, I don't agree with this. I mean, of course, here we should have Thanos Zartoludis, but I don't agree that the word nomos means law. I mean, this is really, actually, the way the Romans translated the Greek word nomos. Nomos is not law in the sense of law. It's actually an idea of orientation, an idea of order that a community actually gives to itself in order to settle or to inhabit a territory. In that sense, nomos is always collective. This is actually, for me, where the modern artists somehow mess up the whole thing, because the idea of autonomy within the modern idea of artistic practice is by definition individual. And this is actually why, you know, through the example of Dürer, we had questioned this aporia, this problem, that from that moment on, autonomy becomes simply a professional, liberal, if you want, aspiration. And I think that for me, for us, for me and Maria, the question of autonomy is to go back to really the idea of nomos, and the idea of creating actually the conditions in which a community or a class or, you know, a collective subject can, you know, define an idea of space. And then actually where perhaps this antithesis between architecture and autonomy would be not an antithesis, but perhaps something that, you know, has a possibility to find a common ground.
Perhaps on that point, I wanted to come back to something that you said earlier about the weak foundations of architecture. And a question is, if that is something unique and productive and something we should cherish, or if it's a fundamental problem that we need to fix in order to survive as a profession. Because teaching in a place like this, one often asks oneself if you teach architects to teach architects to teach architects, and we create these sort of bubbles where it's confusing where we're meant to lead. If you take the other professions that don't have these weak foundations, like medicine or so, when you talk about medicine, again, within medicine, obviously the aim is for it to reach outside. In architecture, there's this confusion around where all of this is meant to lead. If it's meant to lead to buildings that people use, often the people that we teach here that end up doing a lot of buildings, they don't come back here, in fact. Mm-hmm. So the question is this a fundamental problem that we should work towards fixing or not?
I think it's a very good point. And on one hand, of course, you know, thanks God, you know, architecture is not this kind of monolithic discipline that, you know, architects starting from the Renaissance will really try to pretend to systemize. So I think the idea that this project to a certain extent failed, and architecture had to open up itself in a more self-reflexive way, and also in a more exposing its problems and its limits. I think it's certainly something we should cherish and not try to fix. At the same time, you know, if we look at this issue from a professional point of view, we also know that you know, there is an erosion of the profession as a, you know, something that has a relevance within society. And often, actually, the argument is exactly the weak status of the discipline that, you know, doesn't have any more big narratives like used to have in the past. So for me, actually, it's really a question that we can only approach dialectically. On one hand, we have to acknowledge that to, you know, to say everything is architecture and therefore, you know, opening too much the discussion in very vague terms might actually backfire from a professional point of view. At the same time, I think, yes, we should, on the contrary, open up the fact that our discipline, from the very moment it was theorized as a discipline, has fundamental limitations and fundamental structural problems.
I mean, also to make a very, very concrete example of practices that in the last few years we've been looking at that we thought were interesting, were those cases of collectives of architects and builders, for instance, who try to come together, bridging this divide that has been somehow been artificially created 5 or 6 centuries ago. That's not to say that whatever was before that or any kind of non-Western pre-modern practice was necessarily good, but that's just to say that maybe we have other ways to reorganize actually this division of labor that has made such a theme as autonomy fundamental for us today, because maybe we can displace the question on another level. And there have been in the past few years quite a few experiments, quite small for the moment, of collectives that try to then re-manage the practice of building at different levels and in different ways. And we think that those experiments are actually really quite interesting. And of course, within that, quite a big role can be played, and I think that's also an interesting question, by technology. You are probably all aware of the work of Mario Carpo, who of course believes that then we can proactively use technology exactly to bridge that gap that has been artificially created, what he calls actually the Albertian paradigm. So there are possibilities. I think that there are also some very, very concrete possibilities. That's why, again, actually the example of Marie's gallery for me is such an inspiration, because it really means that even within the conditions that we have out there, we are not going to change capitalism anytime soon. We might not even want to do that, to be honest. But we can, in a way, reformulate the way in which actually we practice. And maybe the most immediate case that comes to our mind is really the case of these collectives that try to go, from the managing and the owning and the ownership of land to the design, passing through the whole phase of building and so on and so forth, to try to rethink actually, the division of labor that has been created artificially. So, for instance, I mean, Dogma's worked in the past few years with collectives of artists, for instance, and there are quite a few actually self-building practices also here in London. It's all quite small, but I think, we have to look at those examples that actually are an inspiration, and there are possibilities.
And different disciplines. I think that's for me the key issue here, that we take as a starting point architecture. Architecture is the slowest of many of the disciplines that we work in. One of the funny side projects to keep me working autonomous somewhat is actually probably the largest project I'll ever do, because it's a code. 5 years ago, I wouldn't be comfortable saying this at the AA, but times have changed. And it's a vintage code that I found that a friend of mine who works as a distributor really liked. He was at a point where he had built a network that he wanted to build his own brand. And he asked me, can I use that code that you found? It wasn't a code that you could sell or could easily wear. I just randomly found it at a Nautic store. So we collaborated with a group of people. So what that means is no designer, no investor, no actual hierarchy, and started building this brand that we presented, and within 9 months is now sold worldwide. So if you take this as an example, it's a really interesting exercise, because you work independently, not from within the structure, but none of us have experience in doing any of it. So we just kind of went on the go with it, and it's brought a lot of these desires for autonomy back, but it's a much faster discipline and a much wider discipline, and it's much more about people than anything else. And I think that is something that I find a little bit problematic about this conversation. It's very theory heavy, and it's very kind of linking at history. I'm happy that you bring up recent examples, but I think what you're not talking about is Shop Architects. It's like the largest architecture company in New York that owns the sites that they're building and developing and makes a profit off of it. So there's a lot more happening outside of academia that I think we should look at to really understand where we stand now, and I think also as students where you stand now. Like, use this autonomy, make it your own, because otherwise it's not really gonna go anywhere.
I think actually we have kind of run out of time. If we have one more question, we can probably.
I agree with all this and the whole idea of all becoming entrepreneurial, but at the same time, if we bring it back to the scale of academia, the scale of the institution, I think it's very important to pose the question, what are the problems we need to address now as a collective here? because still we are part of a school, and still we work as a collective here. So I'm trying to understand how all these questions which are being posed in terms of practice or practices outside, how this can actually start feeding back and inform to a great extent what we do as a community, as an institutional community. Because it's easier to talk about the scale of the individual and what can we do, but
maybe the answer is not there. Maybe the answer is more here. The position series was created as a way to try to break those niches that I think, not that I encountered, but talking to each one of the community members of this institution, I was given. I wanted to know what is that we stand for. I wanted to know what is that each one of the postgraduate programs stand for and want to address. So that, in fact, this idea of autonomy is one that somehow has been produced and reproduced to an extent that I think is detrimental sometimes to some of the strengths that we carry. But again, I think it has to do with the vocabulary and terminology. What is that we mean by autonomy, and what is that we actually want to do with it? The way in which these tables or these talks have been organized and the way in which the themes have been brought is to try to take some provocative positions and see and try to articulate them and try to pull them through, and so to see what is that we say when we are using them, right? What is that we actually stand for? And I think it was very deliberate to actually try to bring Pier Vittorio and Maria together with Theo, because if one tries to figure out what is that we mean by autonomy in terms of the aesthetics or in terms of the city or in terms of form, I actually do think that ultimately both of your agendas very clearly are trying to understand what is the power of architecture as a code or as a form of behavior, or as a form of agency, or as a historical accumulation of power structures that actually can and should be disentangled in order to produce new forms of collectivity. Ultimately, is that what we are doing here as a school? But I don't have the feeling that that's what we all collectively agree that we are doing. Sometimes we try to position ourselves against each other, and so the positions that we have within the school are kind of detrimental to the agenda of the school outside of itself. So somehow this is to me an act of positioning ourselves as a school that ultimately believes that architecture as a discipline that has the responsibility and the privilege to articulate all those different conversations that are happening outside and try to contribute to a space that is more ethical, that is driven by things that I think we all would agree is something that has to do by redesigning algorithms and behaviors and really looking into power structures and to understanding architecture not only as built form but also as social form, and that sometimes from a small gallery that tries to defy and redefine the space of capital production or capital reproduction to projects that can try to construct new worlds and understand that media is in fact a medium by which architecture also produces itself, or as an act of curatorial articulation of ideas and people around the world that ultimately lose their notions of authorship. I mean, I dreamed of an office at some point that was called Office Us, in which technology was able to enable that kind of moment of total freedom to really produce those architectures and those worlds that we imagine. But so my answer to you in behalf of everyone is that we are not alone in that quest of trying to find the agency of architecture. I think each one of us within the school is doing, and this position series that Maniji has organized, I think is trying to have that conversation. So I want to thank the speakers. I think we have a bar that is ultimately the space where ultimate autonomy can be gained. Beyond that, I don't want to finish with that note. I want to invite everyone for Thursday, where all the academic staff, but also everyone within the school community is invited to discuss what is the project, the pedagogical project that this school is producing. And I do think that this talk and this conversation today can easily fit into that. Pier Vittorio is going to give us an introduction. I look very much forward to have you be in this room.
Sorry of appearing too many times.
It's okay. It's okay.
For that.
It's okay. It's like, and on Friday we are no. I want to thank you, all of you. Thanks to the speakers.